Happy Monday, everybody. This is going to be a quick run through some repairs that you're probably going to find interesting, and a 10-question pop test at the end, so hang on. An old car is worth what the owner is willing to spend on it, but be careful how much of your own cash you put in there. Every now and then, whenever we at the dealer, somebody try to stick us with one by okaying a repair on a ratty old car that wasn't worth what it was going to cost to fix it, and then they didn't want to pay the bill, or they just leave it there for a mechanic's lien to auction off or whatever. And this Cavalier was an old one, 92 model, and it'd gone belly up at a local credit union. It cranked, but it wouldn't start. So whenever we got there, we found this nesting place. The bird nest was under there. I think I've showed a picture of this a time or two before, but it was real funny. And the guy had been driving the car. That's what was amazing. They had fuel but no spark, and the #1 plug wire was burned out. And we got rid of the bird nest. We replaced these spark plugs. We burned and the burned out plug wires, and they put ignition module on it. This ignition module, the crank sensor was right in behind the module. Some of them had it mounted with a little pigtail, but this one here was right behind it. We got it going that afternoon. This '87 Sierra was a little more involved. This lady I'd known ever since. She's a little blue-haired, blue-white-haired, ladies with the old ladies with the hair. I'd known her ever since I was a little kid. She bought this car new, and she'd been driving it. She'd put lots and lots and lots of miles on it, and it had deteriorated something awful. She went to a shop. They said they put a fuel filter on it. Apparently, they thought it wasn't worth fixing, so they just slammed the fuel filter on it. Didn't do a good job of that. She drove away and noticed it leaking fuel. Was afraid to drive it. Called them. They got a wrecker, hauled it over here, and charged her $87 to have it towed back to the shop, where they generously repaired the fuel leak they created. And she got disgusted with them, and she had a younger guy that was in the community come with her over there to the shop. And this thing right here, she said it would stall, it idle rough, misfired under load, and it had a tire vibration so bad it shake your teeth at 40 miles an hour. We replaced the tires, took care of that. We didn't experience the stalling, but it needed a lot of work by default. Now this one had that Magnavox ignition system on it, and that Magnavox ignition system is the one where you had to replace the whole unit. You couldn't replace any of the separate coils. This happens because of whenever there's a naked spark jumping in there because the wire's burned out in the end, it creates ozone, and ozone's really corrosive because it's 3 molecules of oxygen put together, and it makes it look all rusty. Sometimes it'll look black and dusty in there, but whenever you see one like that, it's because it's had ozone in there trapped in that boot, and it couldn't go anywhere, and it just started working on corroding the metal. Well, it had rough idle and low vacuum, and with the plugs and the wires replaced, it still idled rough, and the intake manifold was kind of hot. Well, that usually means you got EGR flowing, and the vacuum was only about 15 inches, which sort of seemed to support that, but when we pulled the EGR valve, there was no vacuum. There was no leakage there. There was no EGR going in there, so we needed to look somewhere else. Got the scope out, traced the cam and crank sensors. Bert found no cam signal pulse. I said, well, let's go see what's going on there, because it really needs a cam signal so it'll know when to operate the injectors. If it lights them off too soon, while the fire is still burning, you may have some heat coming back into the intake through the intake valves before they close. Now the wires leading to the cam sensor connector had lost their insulation. That's a photo of them. Bert cut out the bare leads, replaced them with a new wire, and we put a new cam sensor on it. The newest cam sensors that you get for these vehicles come with a pigtail, because the connector looks different in there, but that's okay. A lot of the fuel pumps come with pigtails too, like that. But we wound up getting a cam signal, and it cooled everything down. It ran a whole lot better after we did that. See, a lot of vehicles won't even crank with a cam sensor, or won't even start. A lot of your Fords will start with a cam sensor. Some of your Nissans will start, like if you unplug the cam sensor on a Nissan Altima, it may start and it may not. Or if just one of the cam sensors is bad on a Nissan Altima, Nissan with a V6 in it, then you're going to have one that starts hard a lot of the time. So cam sensors are wonky. They don't bad cam sensors don't act the same way on every vehicle. Well, it was still misfiring, ran great in the service bay, but when we test drove it, it suddenly started backfiring and bucking, and then it would stop doing that, and then it would backfire and buck some more, and by the time we got back to the shop, it was running just like it was supposed to. So we put an old-fashioned timing light in there, hooked up one of the plug wires under the hood, dragged it through there and into the car, tape the trigger open so you could watch it down there where it was dark. And when it was running smooth, it was flashing real smooth. But whenever it was cutting out, it was, you know, the flat was really erratic. And I said, that's the module. And a lot of times when the wires and the plugs, you know, you let them get too far gone and they're all that high voltage looking for somewhere else to go, it'll wind up damaging the module, the electronics, and this kind of thing. One way or another, it took a coil pack slash module to get this one done, but it ran really good when we got through. A lot of vehicles will have a tremendous stack of problems that people just keep driving them and kind of do workarounds and all that kind of thing, you know, and that was what she had been doing, just one problem after another piled up. This 626 was a barn car, you know, it'd been sitting in a barn for I don't know how long, but he decided to go and get it going again. So he put a starter, used starter on it, and there was a story about that starter I could tell you about this car too, and I've mentioned it before, but that was the owner's original stated concern. Well, a pair of students reported the coil was weak, but I found out I could stretch the spark almost an inch, and it was really bright, and you know, even right there at the plug. I said, this is not a spark problem or a weak coil. Pump was pulling about 10 amps, but it wasn't spinning. After a year or so, the gas goes bad, ruins the pump, and sometimes other things, you know. And so this 2001 Malibu, incidentally, that got that 626 going. This was a cop car, belonged to the Highway Patrol, believe it or not, but they didn't want to spend a lot of money on it. Apparently it had been impounded, and they changed it into a cop car because it was a sleeper, you know, that they could catch people on whenever you don't know the car is a cop car. You're liable to do stuff you wouldn't do if you see a cop car. And that one day, and I got to stop and tell you this story. One day there was this, I was working on a cop car, and I was just getting ready to take a test drive when I saw my other buddy Mark. His wife dropped him off, and she left, and so I backed out, and she turned left when she got out, and then she went up Cherokee. And so I went up Cherokee behind her. She didn't even realize I was back there on that cop car, or didn't realize it was me driving it, until she happened to look back there. And I noticed the speed limit was 30 and she was running about 45. And when she saw me, oh boy, she froze up and she slowed down to 30 miles an hour, and she pulled up there to that traffic light. And I pulled up there next to her, and on the right side of her, she was sitting there just with her eyes wide, with its, you know, hands froze to the steering wheel, and I honked the horn, and when she looked at me, she got plumb mad because she thought I was a cop, and I wasn't. But I mean, I got other cop car stories I could tell too when I was working on those, but it's funny. Alright, so this one here had 7 volts of voltage drop between the B plus and the starter. They had put a battery on it, but they didn't clean this when they put the battery on it. So I took this ratty old cable and got rid of it, replaced the cable. You know, bought a cable from the parts store and retooled it and soldered everything and made it the same length and all as the original cable, so it looked nice and factory and all that. 16 bucks for that. 97 Accord wouldn't stop. They kept driving it till it got dangerous, and this was what it looked like under there. This car is the same car as that one. And this was just a junky old car. It's worth about $100 sitting beside the road with a for sale sign on it. And this student, some student that was working on this Bronco the day before, and he was doing a worksheet where you pull the stoplight switch off of the under there, and he's going to pull a stoplight switch off, test it, put it back on, all that kind of stuff. He pulled the stoplight switch off. To do that, you got to take the brake pedal push rod loose from the, you know, the brake pedal loose from the master cylinder push rod, and he didn't put it back. He just took it loose, and the pedal was just swinging, and the vehicle was sitting there. He didn't tell anybody that he had left the brake pedal unhooked. I guess he felt like somebody had any sense. Perfect storm happened. You know, the next day my dual enrollment students come in. I said, well, that Bronco needs to be moved out of the service bay. It was sitting there idling, you know, I was warming it up. And one of them says, I want to pull that, back that out. And I didn't see any reason not to let him back it out, but somehow that knothead got it in drive instead of reverse. And I was sitting there in a Chrysler Crossfire over here out where you can't see me, and I watched this thing move forward because he put it in drive. He couldn't get it to stop. He panicked. He was just froze up, and the thing pushed a workbench out of the way and knocked this Honda off the lift and sort of bent the hood on the Bronco and all that. So I says, oh my word, this is a mess. Well, the lady that owned the car, when her son came back, I says, look, this car got knocked off the lift by the Bronco. You know, it's got a dent in the fender now that it didn't have before. And he said, we don't care. This is a junk car. We only drive it when we got nothing else to drive. It's probably going to end up going to the salvage yard before long anyway. Just don't worry about fixing it. But the president of the college decided we needed to fix it anyway. So, I mean, he went ahead and, you know, paid to have the fender damage fixed. Amazingly, that was the only damage that it had. But getting this mess untangled was a bear. But I actually put a directive on the door of the classroom and in other places. I say, if you're parking a car that shouldn't be started or driven, disable the vehicle and put a note on it telling why it's disabled. Because if somebody, if you put just disable the vehicle, they may put the battery cable back on it or whatever and try to drive off. But this was one of those situations where this knothead that did that brake worksheet that left the brake pedal loose had done stuff like that before. He didn't do it on purpose. He was just goofy, and he didn't think about what was going to happen later on. And now, there's some other stuff that guy did too that I don't have time to talk about right now. But anytime you park a car that doesn't have any oil in the crankcase, or if the brakes don't work, or if there's anything wrong, if it's gonna be destroyed by somebody trying to operate it normally, it needs to be disabled, and a sign needs to be put on it saying this crankcase has no oil in it, do not start this engine, or something, or whatever, you know. Time for a practice test. Question 1. Engine sludge that brings about oil starvation and bearing failure can be caused by this: frequent short drives, thermostat stuck open, clogged PCV system, or any of the above. The right answer to that is, look at that. I gave this as the right answer, but that wasn't the right answer, so I failed this particular first part of this test. Any of the above is the answer I should have put. Pardon me for messing that up. Good grief, I don't believe I did that. Question 2. EGR system failure can cause hot combustion events, pinging, higher NOx emissions. Any of the above is the answer to that one. This is the EGR ports like we used to see that would clog up so there no EGR was flowing. If you open the EGR valve and you don't hear the engine start running rough, if you got negative fuel trim, long fuel trim, this fuel trim is going to do whatever it needs to get this back close to zero. So you can't use short fuel trim if the thing comes in and it's been running and adaptive learning has kicked in. Long-term fuel trim minus 25. Okay, so what could that be? Fuel filter restricted, engine oil contaminated with fuel, weak fuel pump, or any of the above. Actually, the engine oil may be contaminated with fuel, because whenever it's drawing that engine oil contamination, the fuel through the PCV system, that's going to be fuel that's not commanded, kind of like what's coming from the, you know, whenever the saturated canister, you know, if a bunch of fuel goes in there. So that's something that you need to think about. As a matter of fact, Ford used to have us, if we were chasing a rich code, Ford would basically have us to remove the PCV valve and stop it up, and then to stop up the place where the PCV valve came from and see if the rich code went away. You see what I mean? Because if it did, you need an oil change. It's as simple as that, and you can still do that even today. If you've got negative fuel trims, you need to check and see if the engine oil is contaminated with fuel, and if you take the PCV system out of the loop, you see, and stop, and I put a piece of paper on it, just let it suck it up there, and then you see those fuel trim numbers start to even out, then you know that you got contamination. If the engine is knocking because of rod bearing failure, it could be due to A, rust clogged injectors, plugged EGR coolant passages, oil pump relief valve spring, any of the above. There's no such thing as EGR coolant passages per se on most vehicles, all right? So oil pump relief valve spring, if the valve relief valve sticks or the spring breaks, you know, you're not going to have any oil pressure. Here's one right here related to that. Which one of these two statements is correct? Joe said an engine oil pump's positive displacement pump. Bob says all engine oil pumps turn at half crankshaft speed. Alright, Joe is the only one that's right about that. This is a positive displacement pump. The oil pump always is, but it has to have a relief valve for you to have pressure. All engine oil pumps don't turn at half crankshaft speed because some of them are driven by the crankshaft. So there's that. All right, question 6. Which of these two statements is correct? Billy says a bad radiator cap can cause rust and corrosion buildup in a car's coolant system. Jack says the large pipe on the heater core is generally the heater core's inlet pipe. Is that true or false? And here's this large one right here. Billy, Jack, both, or neither? Billy is the guy that's right about this. A bad radiator cap, if it's just letting air come and go instead of, keeping it pressurized, it can cause rust buildup in the coolant system because of oxidation from the air that's getting in there. See, that radiator cap's keeping air out so that it keeps everything kind of clean in there. That's really important. If that cap is bad enough to where air can come and go, though, you're going to have rusty stuff in there. Now, which of these two statements is correct? A 50-50 mix of coolant and distilled water is the optimum mix for all climates. Statement 2, water pumps are driven by the back surface of the serpentine belt, and a water pump driven with the engine timing belt spin in opposite directions. All right. Now then, think about this. Statement 2, if it's driven by the back surface of the serpentine belt, it's going to spin the opposite direction from the rest of the engine. If you have, like on some of the Jeeps, they would have 2 different belt systems depending on how the thing was set up. And the water pumps looked exactly alike, but the impellers were fixed different. And if you put the wrong water pump on there, it would overheat because the pump was spinning backwards. Believe it or not, that was the thing. A 50-50 mix of coolant and distilled water is not necessarily the optimum mix for all climates. If you're in really, really, really hot weather, you might need to put a little more antifreeze than water. And you can basically look that up. Just do a search saying is a 50-50 coolant mix always the optimum mix. Just ask that question on Google. You'll see answers for that. Statement 1, injector firing frequency is directly tied to cam sensor input. Firing frequency, that's how often it clicks. Statement 2, injector pulse width is determined by crank position sensor input. Neither one of those are right. The firing frequency is determined by the crank position sensor input. The pulse width comes from other sensors, about engine load. Cam position sensor tells it when to operate when to put in the next. Basically, this is one of the basic reasons for the cam sensor. It tells it when to squirt the fuel next. I talked about that a little bit earlier. The technician is investigating a no start and wet spark plugs on the Dodge with these PID values. What's the most likely reason for the no start? Incidentally, let me back up. If the cam sensor is not putting out on some of these, it will bank fire the injectors instead of firing them sequentially too. So you need to and also there are sometimes if the cam sensor, like if you unplug the cam sensor on a Nissan Altima, it may start and it may not, because it don't know which injector to click first. But if you've just got one cam sensor that's bad on a Nissan that's a V6, it'll start hard. We had one that had a burned up starter because it would spin and spin and spin, and finally it would start up. They just kept starting it like burnt the starter up. And then I found out that one of the cam sensors was bad, and we replaced that cam sensor and it started really fast. Technicians investigate a no start wet plugs on the Dodge with these PID values. What's most likely reason? Faulty baro sensor, bad throttle sensor, an open IET sensor, none of the above. Open IET sensor, because the Dodge will substitute, usually it's 104, not 101 that it puts in there. And if you notice that transmission oil temperature and engine coolant temperature are both real close together, but intake air temperature, if you're looking at the generic data stream, it'll say 40 below. But if you look at the enhanced data stream, it'll say 101. So that was almost a trick question there. Question 10, it's a true story. Inside door handle on a 2005 Nissan Sentra is being replaced for a quoted door price of $350. This blonde lady that they thought was dumb as a brick went in there to the Nissan dealer in another town, not the one in this town. And they literally told her they wanted $350 parts and labor. And I think the dealer price was $42 on that door handle. And I said, well, this is fair because it requires a lot of skill, or it's highway robbery because it's an easy job. His robbery, that's ridiculous. One of my students put that thing on there in 20 minutes and he had never even done one of those before. Why in the world were they trying to charge her that? Alright, that's the end of the video. I hope you guys have a great week. We've been here about 20 minutes, and maybe you've had time to listen to this one instead of letting your attention span shut it off before we were done. I'll see you next week.